And welcome to a very special edition of Stacklebeck on Terror. We are going to spend the next 30 minutes taking an in-depth look at the most dangerous terrorist group in the world. But this is no ordinary terror group. This is a terrorist army, and it's not al-Qaeda, it's Hezbollah. With help from its Iranian overlords, the Lebanon-based jihadi militia is making big moves in the Middle East and in the Western Hemisphere. That's right. Hezbollah is in your backyard. And who better to fill us in on the latest moves from Hezbollah than Lebanon native and world-renowned terrorism expert, Dr. Walid Faris. Walid advises the U.S. Congress and European Parliament on counterterrorism issues, and he's also the best-selling author of the epic trilogy, Future Jihad, The War of Ideas, and the Confrontation, as well as the hot new release, The Coming Revolution. All of them are must-reads. And Walid, welcome to Stacklebeck on Terror.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me today.
Always a pleasure to have you, my friend. And I think we're going to get really in-depth today on Hezbollah, the most dangerous terrorist army in the world. But first, for the uninitiated, perhaps some viewers don't know a whole lot about Hezbollah. Walid, briefly, who is this group and why are they so dangerous, not only in the Middle East, but to America?
Well, Hezbollah was actually created by the Iranian regime in the early 80s, sometime between 1980 and 1982. After the takeover in Iran by the Khomeini regime, the Pasdaran Iranian Revolutionary Guard came to the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon and recruited a number of Islamists, militia members, and launched Hezbollah. That Hezbollah in 1983 attacked United States Marines who were as a peace force in Lebanon trying to protect civilians and killed hundreds of them, and then killed hundreds of French, and then organized the hostage taken in Beirut. And Hezbollah for many, many years became one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations until 9/11.
And this is a group founded by the Iranian regime, by the Ayatollahs. This is really an arm of Iran.
It's the long-range arm of the Iranian regime that operates in Lebanon. But since Hezbollah also operates outside Lebanon, they have cells, as we're going to be talking about, in Africa and Latin America, secret cells in the West. This is really the long strategic arm of Iran.
They're everywhere. And Walid, as you said, they attacked the U.S. Marine barracks, killed 243 American Marines. In 1983, they've also carried out attacks right here in the Western Hemisphere, which we're going to talk a bit about. But first, let's focus on Lebanon, your home country, and a place which is really Hezbollah's seat of power.
Well, the most recent and dangerous development was a few weeks ago when a new government in Lebanon was formed, and that government is controlled by Hezbollah. The story began in 2008 when Hezbollah forces invaded West Beirut and attacked villages in the mountain and threatened the then Cedars Revolution government, which was pro-Western, a government that was formed as a result of the demonstrations that took to the streets of Beirut in 2005, and took place also after the withdrawal of the Syrian army from Lebanon. At the time, Bashar al-Assad withdrew the Syrian army, but a second army remained in Lebanon, and that's Hezbollah. So that army, as of 2008, day after day, months after months, threatened the Lebanese, in many cases organized killing of politicians and or attacks against urban areas of Lebanon, including security officers who were in charge of investigations. The bottom line is, as of last week, we have now in Lebanon a cabinet which is controlled by Hezbollah. Many ministries are controlled by Hezbollah.
Which means that, in effect, since Hezbollah was created by Iran, again, and is funded by Iran, controlled from Tehran, if Hezbollah is running Lebanon, does that mean, can we say, is it a stretch to say that Iran is now running Lebanon?
No, that's a reality. That's what we call a strategic reality. Hezbollah itself, on the homepage and website of its Secretary General a few years ago, we're very proud to say, we are the representatives, not just of the Iranian regime, of Ayatollah Khamenei, so the personal representative of the top leader of Iran. But what we know, what our government knows and our allies knows, is that Hezbollah is linked directly, not just to the Pasdaran, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, but to a special body, a special force inside that Pasdaran force, which is known as the Quds Force, the Jerusalem Force.
Right. They are the elite jihadis within the Iranian regime.
They are the elite jihadis within the Iranian regime. And actually, the Iranian regime always makes statements about Hezbollah. So Hezbollah makes statements about its connection to the Iranian regime. And that regime says, well, Hezbollah is our best elite force in the world against, their enemies.
Now, before all this developed, Walid, it seemed like perhaps the Lebanese police, Lebanese security forces, Lebanese army weren't controlled by Hezbollah. They still had some independence. But now, could we see a scenario, a nightmare scenario, where Hezbollah has actually thoroughly infiltrated the Lebanese army and the Lebanese security services?
Well, since the Syrian invasion of Lebanon, to remind our viewers, in 1990 took over Lebanon, most of the Lebanese army control systems, the second bureau, meaning the intelligence services, were controlled by the Syrians, and the allies of the Syrians were Hezbollah. In 2005, Syria withdrew from Lebanon. So there was this window, which is like the Prague Spring, the Lebanon Spring, between 2005 and 2008, where there was a chance for the Lebanese army, internal security forces of being independent and joining the West again. Unfortunately, as of 2008, Hezbollah moved again, crumbled that cabinet, and now Hezbollah controls not just ministries in the Lebanese cabinet. They have elements inside the security services of the Lebanese army, meaning, in a way, Hezbollah controls national security in Lebanon.
So they are thoroughly, thoroughly infiltrated. Walid, what are your contacts, your sources on the ground inside Lebanon? You have great contacts throughout Lebanon, particularly in the Christian community there. What are they saying about this?
Well, first of all, throughout Lebanon, what we see right now is an expansion of Hezbollah units' presence. Traditionally, Hezbollah was found in the south of Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. That's a traditional area. But then they started to move and infiltrate to the mountains. Mount Lebanon, traditionally Druze and Christian, and most recently, according to reports, including in As-Siyasa of Kuwait and other Arab media, Hezbollah cells and units were found in the northern part of Lebanon, putting artillery units or so on the Syrian-Lebanese border. So now we're not talking about Hezbollah just facing Israel, Hezbollah across the whole Lebanese country.
They're expanding their power greatly, which means Iran is expanding its power greatly. This is obviously a huge threat to Israel, which we're going to look at the map in a second, sits on Lebanon's southern border. But real quick, what is the Obama administration saying about all this and the U.S. Congress?
Well, look, over the past weeks, when a number of NGOs, including Lebanese-American NGOs and other, NGOs that watches terrorism, when they asked sources in the administration, what are you going to be doing? What's your attitude towards the new Hezbollah-controlled Lebanese cabinet? The answer came that we are observing. We're going to wait for the, the statement made, but the statement is made already. This is a Hezbollah organized coup to take over Lebanon. Unfortunately, the Obama administration is not there to contain Hezbollah. We have not seen signs since the 2009 that the Obama administration is committed to that. On paper, of course, they are always saying about their concerns with regard to Hezbollah. But Hezbollah is on our list of terrorist organizations.
That's right. And we're going to talk a bit more about Hezbollah, what this administration should do about Hezbollah at the end. But right now, we're going to walk over to the maps, Walid. I want you to give us a closer look at Lebanon and Hezbollah's power bases within the country. Let's head over to the maps right now.
Absolutely.
We're going to take an up-close look at Lebanon and Hezbollah's power base in that country. So, Walid, take us through. Where is Hezbollah mainly based in Lebanon? And you see Israel right there on Lebanon's southern border.
Well, traditionally, Hezbollah's forces have always been deployed along the southern border of Lebanon, northern border of Israel. This is where they conducted their warfare with the Israelis. But they are basically supported by the deployment of Hezbollah along what we call the Bekaa Valley. And the Bekaa Valley has borders with Syria. So the Iranians bring their support to Syria and from Syria into the Bekaa and into southern Lebanon.
So the weapons that go to Hezbollah, and the Israelis say, Walid, that Hezbollah has some 50,000 rockets right now aimed at Israel. So those... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Those 50,000 rockets have the usual rockets, but they have also missiles. And the missiles may also be deployed not just along the borders where you have United Nations forces, but in the Bekaa and on the mountains.
And those missiles are coming through Iran, right here, through Syria, up into the Bekaa Valley, then down into the hands of Hezbollah right here in the south, where they're literally, as you can see, on Israel's doorstep.
Well, absolutely. The most important border really is not Israel-Lebanon, because you know, the Israelis usually know how to defend themselves here, and there is a United Nations force here. It's the Syrian-Lebanese border, because that border is between not just Hezbollah and Syria. It's technically between Hezbollah and Iran. Iranian forces, Iranian logistics can come through Syria into Lebanon through these borders.
That's a great point. Let's make that clear. This is Iran's western border. This is Iran's border with Israel because, as we've made clear, Hezbollah is controlled by Iran. They are a fully functioning arm of the Iranian regime. So, Waleed, we see Hezbollah and Iran, of course, present here in the south, here along Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, stretching all the way to the Syrian border, and here in the suburbs of Lebanon's capital of Beirut.
In this part of Lebanon, the southern suburb of Beirut, as you said, is the actual headquarters, the international headquarters and national headquarters of Hezbollah. What has happened over the past 2 years, and now a few weeks ago, is that Hezbollah is sending their patrols across the Lebanese mountains. These areas have never been under Hezbollah. Now they are going to go under that control, which means, Eric, regionally speaking, that the Iranians eventually, through Syria, can get to those mountains and install their missiles.
And that's going to lead, God forbid, to war, Waleed. And we're going to talk about what the shape of a future Middle East war would look like after the break. Stay tuned. And welcome back. I'm joined once again by Dr. Waleed Phares, and we're discussing the shape of what a future Middle East war could look like. And Waleed, you just described how Hezbollah has such a presence throughout Lebanon. We've discussed how they're basically controlling the Lebanese government, which means Iran is controlling Lebanon. We talked about the missiles, the rockets littered throughout southern Lebanon on Israel's very doorstep. We have Hamas in Gaza. We have Hamas elements in the West Bank. Syria, hostile to Israel. What are we seeing here shaping up?
Well, Hezbollah traditionally has deployed its forces and its missiles in Lebanon, in the south, in the Bekaa, targeting the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis would react against them. But the bigger picture of Hezbollah is that if there is an engagement between them and Israelis, they would like to see the Syrian regime using its missile force also to shell the Israelis, and at the same time activate Hamas missile force so that they would have a concerted effort from Lebanon, from Syria, and from Gaza, and of course from the Iranian side. Right. One change could occur. If there is a regime change in Syria, then you're going to have probably more of a Muslim Brotherhood influence here. And if the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt will become more influential, they will be the ones to back up Hamas and not Iran.
So Israel's completely surrounded. You're going to have the Brotherhood in Egypt, possibly the Brotherhood in Syria, but Assad is just as bad. Hezbollah, Hamas. It's almost a pincer movement surrounding Israel here. They're completely surrounded.
They are surrounded geostrategically speaking. It all depends on what's going to happen in Lebanon. If Hezbollah continues to dominate, then they're going to try to get closer to a confrontation. It all depends on what's going to happen to the Assad regime in Syria, and it's going to depend what's going to happen in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood.
So missiles from Syria, missiles from Lebanon, missiles from Gaza, slamming tiny Israel on all sides. And David, we can take a look at the broader map of the Middle East real quick. Okay, here's Israel, Lebanon. Here is Iran. Waleed, how would Iran get involved in any conflict? Or would they get involved directly or act just through their proxies?
Well, the Iranian strategies, Eric, for the last 10 years have been very active in creating what I call the bridge, the Eastern Front, meaning the Iranians now have an influence inside Iraq, in the southern part of Iraq, through the Mahdi forces and through other allies. And those areas that are Shia have elements that are very close to the Iranians. The Iranian vision, strategically, is to create that bridge through Iraq to Syria, from Syria into Hezbollah, and from Hezbollah into Israel. There is another axis of development of Iranian interest, which is Iran into Eastern Arabia. they are activating their forces or their cells inside eastern Arabia. Let's remember that Iran has also an interest in northern Yemen with the Houthi rebels. Iran Navy today has facilities in Eritrea, and there is a developing relationship between the Iranian regime and Sudan. And let's close by saying that the Iranian Navy has been able to cross the Suez Canal into the eastern Mediterranean. Right. That would give you, Eric, the view of what is Iran doing in the region.
It's all pervasive, and Waleed, we've also discussed how Iran is trying to establish Red Sea bases right along here. And this new Egyptian government and possibly the Muslim Brotherhood in the future looks like they'll be a lot friendlier towards Iran than the Mubarak regime was.
Well, to us in the United States, one of the most important and dangerous things the Iranians are doing, in addition, of course, to destabilizing the region, is this. We have our presence and our task forces in the Gulf just to contain the Iranians. Guess where the Iranians are? Behind our back in the Red Sea.
Waleed, we're seeing here how Hezbollah, Iran are in great position to control the Middle East. Coming up, we're going to talk about their presence right here in the Western Hemisphere. Don't move. And welcome back. I'm joined once again by Dr. Waleed Faris discussing the Hezbollah threat. And Waleed, we've discussed in depth Hezbollah's threat to the Middle East. But this is a global jihadist operation. Tell us a bit about what Hezbollah is doing on a global scale.
Well, Eric, beyond the Middle East, as we mentioned, Iraq and the other Arab countries, Hezbollah is really of a reach very similar and comparable to al-Qaeda in the sense that they are now operating in Africa, in many areas in Africa, according to reports. The most important one is West Africa, from Senegal all the way on the western coast to Nigeria. They are involved in the diamond ring. They are involved in the network of security companies. And Hezbollah is also found in Sudan, where they have a relationship with the regime. Hezbollah is found in South Asia, and most recently the Europeans have been talking about Hezbollah found in Europe, including in Germany and in other parts.
And I'm sure in Europe, especially, Waleed, they have cells that are poised to strike.
In the case of a confrontation with NATO or with the United States, they will operate in Europe. They're projected to operate in Europe as well.
On the orders of their Iranian masters.
Always. The Iranian command is the central command of Hezbollah, which would operate on their behalf.
Now, in West Africa, you mentioned they're involved in the diamond trade. I've reported here on Stackleback on Terror that they're involved even in drug smuggling. That's very un-Islamic of them. What is their goal there to get involved in these illicit activities?
These are weak states, and we know that there are many businesses, communities, originally coming from Lebanon to do business. So if Hezbollah can control, and it does, Lebanon, then it can control segments of its diaspora. That's the equation that has not been seen before, because they would threaten those families and those communities in Lebanon when they return for the summer vacation, and then they will ask them to hire their members. And once they are in Africa, once they have these prerogatives, then they can infiltrate further these countries.
Okay, so we've established that Hezbollah is a major regional power in the Middle East. They're a major presence in Africa, a major presence in Europe. How about right here in the Western Hemisphere, the United States? First, give me kind of an overview on what Hezbollah is doing in the Western Hemisphere.
Look, Eric, Hezbollah has crossed the Atlantic. It's a transatlantic, trans-Mediterranean organization which basically has been found in many countries in South America and Latin America. Again, they followed the stream of the Lebanese diaspora, trying to infiltrate some of these communities. So the oldest trace that we had found from Hezbollah's activities is in the tri-border area, all the way in the south of the cone of Latin America between Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. They have established networks there. We know al-Qaeda is present there as well. But the most important presence of Hezbollah follows really the lead of the Iranian regime and Hugo Chavez's regime. Remember, they have created an alliance, a strategic alliance between the two regimes based on money, finances, soon-to-be missile deployments. And as a result of that, Hezbollah is now found in Venezuela. They have their presence in Caracas. They do travel in and out of Venezuela into other countries of Latin America, including the Caribbean, but also, worrisome to us, Mexico.
Yeah, and we've reported on this show extensively, Waleed, how Hezbollah is involved in Venezuela via Iran and how Hezbollah may even be training Venezuelan security forces. Moving on to Mexico, which you mentioned. We have a real threat of Hezbollah perhaps hooking up even with, some reports have said, Mexican drug cartels to get across the border. Talk about that a bit, how Hezbollah is trying to become entrenched on our southern border.
Absolutely. Actually, you have reported about Hezbollah in Mexico, and members of Congress, including Congresswoman Sue Myrick on the Intelligence Committee, has repeated the concern that we have and other governments have, and Mexican sources have confirmed this to me, that Hezbollah is now present south of our borders. Yes, they do have connections to the drug cartels on the one hand. They use them, they give them services, but they are also training their own cells on passing through our borders. Remember, we do have national security problem on our southern borders, and Hezbollah is one of these jihadi organizations trying to use these borders. The ultimate strategic goal of Hezbollah out of Mexico is basically to put their cells inside the United States. Train them outside the United States because we're good at finding them here if they start to train, and then put sleeper cell inside the United States as a back burner. When the Iranians will order them, this is when we're going to feel and see Hezbollah.
And real quick, Waleed, they have accomplished that. Does Hezbollah have a presence in America? I've been to Dearborn, Michigan, a hotbed of Hezbollah support.
Well, according to our government, they have busted several Hezbollah cells on minor issues or on more important issues, not yet on the terrorist strategic issues, because Hezbollah, unlike al-Qaeda, has not decided to strike yet. They are trying to determine which the targets would be for their future activities, and they're extremely well disciplined. If they do not get the orders yet from the Iranian regime, they're not going to expose themselves. So we know they're here. We see their literature, as you just said, in many places. Their websites talk about their presence here. So Hezbollah is in America.
And coming up, we're going to talk about what to do about this Hezbollah threat. Stay tuned. And welcome back. I'm joined by Dr. Waleed Faris. Waleed, it's been a mind-blowing 30 minutes, I would say. You've revealed so many horrifying details about the Hezbollah presence, not only in the Middle East, but here in America, in the Western Hemisphere. Big question, everyone's wondering, what can we do about it here in America? And in specific, what can this administration do about it?
Well, first of all, law enforcement, national security agencies are doing a good job. They are going after Hezbollah whenever they can find it. But what is very important, I'd say even crucial for the administration to do, is to educate its own bureaucracy. There's where the problem is, meaning we need to make sure that every single agency, every single unit that is working on counterterrorism is briefed on what Hezbollah is, so that academic research that says, well, Hezbollah is just a liberation army or what have you, which we have seen traces of, is not what our people should listen to. Congress should do a lot of work in terms of hearing about Hezbollah, and the public should be educated. Hezbollah is a threat of a strategic nature. We're going to actually see that the Iranians will activate Hezbollah if we have a crisis with Iran. So we've got to be ready.
Waleed, thanks again for breaking it all down for us. And thanks again to you for joining us on this special edition of Stackleback on Terror. And remember to keep it right here as we report on the advancing global jihad that's in your backyard. Take care and God bless.